The first question that we got, we're actually going to answer two questions in one. What actually is data? This question came from a journalist, and it is an interesting issue. I actually was able to speak with this person and who asked this question. And one of the things that they found is when they're having conversations about kind of database journalism or using data to write a journalism story, it seems to be very confusing to them because some people think that data is like the responses to a survey. And some people think data is kind of the findings of a journal article or a piece of research, and lots of other things in between. So how do we talk about that? What do we mean when we have a conversation that says, where did you get the data in your data journalism story? Or where did you get the data for your research report? And accompanying that question, this one came through the anonymous survey. So I don't have any background on who is asking this, but what is the real difference between qualitative data and quantitative data? So you'll hear that a lot in people talking about data. They'll say, oh, I'm very comfortable working with quantitative data, but I don't know that much about qualitative data. What does that even mean? So we're going to look at these two questions together in a series of slides. So this is a great example of what data can look like in the wild. This is a project that I'm working on in rural Bangladesh. And these are two women that live there, and they are part of a group that is collecting data about the different ways to get more milk from their dairy cows. So this is them collecting data on what they feed their cows, what kind of vitamins they're giving their cows. And you can see that this data is largely in pictures. So they're putting stickers on the grid when certain things happen. So that is what we would call microdata. So microdata is the actual kind of smallest, most granular type of data that is being collected. So for the women who are collecting data about their cows and the food that they eat and the vitamins that they get and things like that, and then how much milk they produce, the microdata is for one cow, what were all those stickers? So for one cow, what did that cow eat that day? What vitamins did that cow have that day? And how much milk did that cow give that day? So that's microdata from that example. In this example, this is what you're looking at on the screen now is actually an example of a administrative survey that a national statistics body like Statistics Canada or the Census Bureau of the US or Eurostat, they collect national data, and you can see that each person in this data set has one row. So there's an ID number and a state and a self-identified race and a self-identified gender and a self-reported annual income amount. So each person is one row. This is called microdata. So this data has not been very processed, and it's very hard to kind of get knowledge or information from microdata. People generally take microdata and they aggregate it. So using the administrative data that we were just looking at, you can see that we can aggregate that data into different groups. So we can look at groups of race, groups of gender, and then average what their incomes are. So aggregate data takes the microdata that you have and groups it and then processes it in some way. In this example, we've taken an average income. So for the journalist that asked the first question, aggregate data is what journalists are often using. Journalists are not often using microdata, not never, but to get microdata into something called aggregate data takes a fair amount of sophistication. You need to aggregate it in ways that will preserve the knowledge and the information without accidentally introducing too much error. So that's aggregate data. And then microdata and aggregate data are usually combined together to create statistical information. And so this is sometimes what everyone will also call data, is statistical information. So if I build a model with the data that we're looking at about income, race, and gender, I can build a model that predicts how much a person's income will be based on the combination of their race and gender. And I can build that model using the microdata, and then I'll get different kinds of information. Like I can say, I use my statistical model to find out that men in this sample are earning about $20,000 more than women. So that's statistical information. It's not actually aggregated data, because it isn't just taking the data and summing it up. And building a model, which is introducing a certain amount of probability. And that's statistical information. So that's often used a lot by journalists as well, and often called data as well. And then often this statistical information is put into words and put into a research report or an article in a journal or a piece in a newspaper or an online website. For example, men in this state tend to earn 84% more than women on average, plus or minus 2%, which is a very important part of the statistical information. Because like I said, statistical information isn't just aggregating, you're introducing some probability and some uncertainty. So this is often called data as well. I would say when I do a lot of work with journalists, which I really, really love. And when I'm talking to most journalists or editors and they say, we want to include some data in this news story, usually what they're talking about is this. So statistical information that's been included and that can be part of the narrative. So men in this state tend to earn 84% more than women is a form of data. And if you want to make sure that you're on the same page as the person you're talking to, it's a good idea to spend some time getting clear on what exactly you mean by data. Do you mean microdata, aggregate data, or statistical information? Oh, so I'm going to back up a couple of slides to talk about what's the difference between qualitative data and quantitative data. So now that we've kind of talked about what data actually is, we want to talk about what is the difference between qualitative data and quantitative data. So of course, this is a huge question, and it's one of the things about running a data amnesty salon is that we need to find ways to talk to each other about pretty complicated and nuanced things in ways that are accessible and don't turn into some kind of 4-hour PhD lecture. Not that those are bad, 4-hour PhD lectures are great, but that's not the point of this particular event, this particular salon. So essentially, the traditional definition of quantitative data is data that can be counted. So for example, in this case, the average income is quantitative data because that's something you can actually count. It's physical, it exists in physical form, and you can actually count up. In the olden days, if you were paid in dollars, you could actually count the dollars. In more modern times, you can get a quantifiable physical count of the number of dollars in your bank account that were deposited by your employer or by your job, and that's your average income. So quantitative data is something that you can measure with numbers or count. Other examples of quantitative data, in addition to income, are things like your height, because you can measure that with a ruler and kind of count it up in numbers. So height is a good example because the units of measurement can change. You can measure in centimeters, you can measure in feet, you can measure in meters, you can measure in all kinds of other systems of linear measurement. But those are all ways to count. Qualitative data traditionally is used to define data that can't actually be counted and is more of a traditionally defined as a softer form of data and oriented more towards narrative and concepts. So qualitative data tends to be more conceptual. So for example, race is technically a qualitative variable. You can't count whether somebody is an American Indian, Asian, Black, or white. That isn't something that you can measure with a ruler. It's not something that you can count in dollars and cents. It is a concept that is softer in nature than something that you can, hold in your hand and count. So technically, that's a qualitative variable. Now, if somebody says they're a qualitative researcher, it's likely that they use different research methods. There's tons of very good books on qualitative research that you can find out there. But essentially, that person is going to not count things and then aggregate them and sum them up and put them through models, as much as they're going to spend time talking to people, observing people, conducting focus groups, conducting ethnographic research. Things like that are usually considered qualitative methods, whereas quantitative methods are more like, measuring how many clicks a website gets, or measuring the height of children as they're growing up. Those are qualitative research. However, this has really become blurred in modern data times because we now have huge amounts of computing power, which allows us to do things with data that would have traditionally been considered qualitative data and turn it into what would traditionally be considered quantitative data. So for example, if we think about sentiment analysis, so things like comments on a website. So some of my clients run consumer-facing websites, and they get comments from those consumers. If they're launching a new makeup product, they'll wait and see what the reviews are, what the comments are. So that's qualitative data, right? People writing out paragraphs and sentences of reviews of a newly launched makeup product. It's qualitative data. Somebody attending a local city hall meeting and then filling out a comment form afterwards is qualitative data. However, we now have this new stuff where we can feed all that qualitative data, all that text, into a bunch of algorithms. Some of them are called natural learning processing, or NLP. But you don't need to understand that. You just need to know that that qualitative data, those texts, those comments, are getting fed into computer algorithms that are then turning them into numbers. So they're turning them into numbers of kind of satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 5. How satisfied were people? They're counting up things. How many times did people reference this or that? And how intensely were the people talking? So there's intensification ratings. So if somebody said something that kind of seemed positive about your new makeup line, did it seem intensely positive, or was it just kind of mildly positive? So this is the same way that this is a way that qualitative data is kind of slowly turning quantitative. And it's the same thing with this example here, where we're looking at, say, race and gender. Race and gender are technically qualitative things. They are self-identified, they are fluid to a certain extent, and they aren't binary. However, in statistical analysis, because so many people in this day and age want to run their data through statistical analysis, we turn things like race and gender into quantitative data. So in this case with American Indian, Asian, Black, and white, we might assign those a number, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in any order, and then put that into a statistical model. So that's technically a way of putting kind of qualitative data into a quantitative model. So we need to be very careful about not being too, when we talk about qualitative data and quantitative data, being careful that there are a lot of nuances these days, that it's not just focus groups and surveys, how it was in the old days. So that is the beginning of the answer to qualitative and quantitative data. And we have a comment. Great, thank you. We're so happy to get live comments. My screen temporarily froze. Did you say gender was qualitative or quantitative? Thank you for your question. Whoops, which I accidentally made really big. I said that gender was qualitative because it can't be counted and it's self-identified and it isn't binary. However, that's probably technically an opinion, as everything is in statistics. So that is what I said. Excellent. There we go. So we're going to leave that question there.